in 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Loa Boots. Start your day off on the right foot with footwear that was designed for those who stand relentlessly in the face of adversity. I wear Loa every single day, for miles on canine searches and for hours on tactical operations in inclement weather. No matter what, Loa keeps me moving. Whether you run, hike, hunt, or fight, on the streets or out in the woods, Loa has the gear you need to help you conquer whatever challenges you face. Go check out their new line of trail running shoes at Loa Boots, L-O-W-A Boots.com, and get outside for some fresh air and daylight. Loa, for those who know where they're going and won't stop until they get there.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com.
So this one's an ugly one. And up front, I'm going to keep it real with you that I actually had a hard time putting this one together. We are going to talk in detail about a pretty nasty serial killer, kidnapper, child rapist. And it's going to read a lot like a horror story because it kind of is. Not kind of. Like, it legitimately is the big scary type. So, trigger warning, if that's the sort of thing that might upset you. Viewer or listener discretion, I should say, is advised here. But if you listen to this podcast, you're probably pretty serious about preventing or stopping or intervening or dealing with this sort of thing. So we probably need to understand this sort of thing and like get serious about understanding some of the intricacies. And so here we are.
Yeah. Mike and I were talking over business development on this podcast and what this podcast is, like what our niche in the tactical communities and the tactical industries are, right? Like, we're not purely a shooting podcast. We're not purely a cop podcast. You know, we're something else, right? And we noticed that a lot of the industry tends to get wrapped up in what we would describe as minutia, right? Loctite on screws, dry fire drills on one side of the spectrum. And that stuff is important in a way. Or on the other side of the spectrum, it's like big feels, wellness and stretching. And that is also important, but there's a lot in the middle that we tend to miss, right? And I would describe that as operationalizing, right? The transition of big strategy into individual tactics. And I think where we, it's kind of silly to say it, where we make the most money, which is funny because we don't make really much money at all on this podcast, is in our case studies, right? And there are really critical lessons in those case studies, and we can kind of shape the orientation part of your OODA loop if you've seen these things coming beforehand, right? You're not going to live long enough to learn all your lessons, but you can learn some of them here.
And I think it's something that on the business development side of it, we dove into some of our like download statistics and like what things are popular with the audience. And a lot of this for me and Jim has just been a creative outlet. It's a passion project. It's not something that we necessarily do for other people so much as we think that other people might value from it, right? And the case studies have always been very, very popular. In fact, one of the things that I learned diving into this was that 9 out of our top 10 episodes ever downloaded are case studies. And I actually think it's a encouraging thing about our audience. It says a lot about you, the listener, that you're out here seeking educational stuff. You're trying to learn from history. And I think that's a big deal. And I think that's something huge. And this is something that I struggle with a little bit, only because I didn't get into this to do case studies per se. It was part of the equation, but not the equation, right? And so it's telling for us to see that, hey, this is what's actually getting consumed the most, right? And so, like, on one hand, you could say, oh, we'll do more of that, right? But, like, that's not all. Hopefully, it's not all we bring to the table. It's not the only. A lot of people do case studies really, really well. There's documentaries out there. There's YouTube channels and interviews, and there's lots of people that do that better than us in a lot of ways. But hopefully, what we bring to it is some, like, editorial, right? And I think that's, like, to capture a little bit of what Jim is saying. The minutia is important, and like the tactical stuff, and like, oh, gun stuff, and, you know, best way to clear a room, hostage rescue, survival, like catch bad guys and terrorists and all that. Like, there's a lot of that stuff that is interesting and validating, right, for the sort of stuff that we do, but is also not the everyday stuff that most of us deal with either. Right. And so we have to, like, balance that a little bit.
And we don't want to be just a true crime podcast. And we don't want to be a murder porn podcast. That's not our style. Right. It's about learning the lessons from it. And specifically with the extreme case studies like this one, we talk a lot about risk management. Right. And there's if you hear hoofbeats, is it a horse or is it a zebra? And I need you to know what is possible versus what is likely. And I think this scenario is a classic of, like, what is possible, what you have to have within your realm of comprehensible outcomes.
Yeah.
Right. The stuff that you need to see coming.
And that's part of it is, like, when I say it's telling about our audience, I think it's validating in the sense that when I go to sponsors, just as an example, right? And not to, like, dive into the business side of this, because it really is not much of a business. Like, like Jim said, like, we don't make money off of this, really. There's some funding involved, and it covers some expenses and stuff, but it's not like this isn't a cash cow.
Yeah, we're not here to get rich. We're here to try to make you smart.
We
right?
both have full-time jobs and careers that, like, do that. But in terms of what it tells us about our audience, and one of the things that we tell to our sponsors is that hey, this is like an educated listener. These are the types of people that want to learn things. And where I go with that is, like, institutional knowledge. And when it comes to decision making and what informs decision making, there's that, like, spectrum of things that are the most likely and the most severe, right? And the most likely things often are not that severe, but you always have to, like, account for, but there's a what if. What if the guy is that bad, right?
Yeah, the guy you just pulled over is Ted Bundy. Okay, well, that's how you're going to catch Ted Bundy, is by at least acknowledging the possibility that guy is the real a-hole, right?
Right.
So, Mike, I understand you're at, like, a Denny's recently.
I wasn't at the Denny's. I passed by a Denny's. I was visiting.
Was it next to a La Quinta, which is Spanish for next to a Denny's? Was that where you were? La Quinta?
Totally. Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, which is a small, pretty quiet, like, retirement type community, vacation type community. There's a lake there. Very pretty, gorgeous place. Pretty quiet, really. And someone was telling me,
great place for Californians to move.
Passing by, one of the people I was with was like, oh, hey, that's the Denny's where Joseph Duncan was captured. And I was like,
who's that?
Who? Come again? Never heard of this, right? So go to my phone and do a quick Google, find the Wikipedia, and I come across this story of this Joseph Duncan guy, which was actually a pretty recent case, all things considered, 2005. And holy shit, this one caught my attention. And my first thought was, how have I not heard of this? This is insane. Like, this is crazy. So, to dive into the story, just kind of feet first here, in May of 2005, a sheriff's deputy in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, responds to a 911 call for service in which a neighbor calls and says, "Hey, I went over to my neighbor's house. The boy there, he was a 13-year-old boy named Slade Groene. I went over there to try to pay him money because he was mowing my lawn, so I owed him money. I went to go drop it off. I knocked on the door. No one answered. There's blood on the door, and I don't know what's happening. Send help. Like, we need to check if they're okay." The deputy that responded to this residence, who was familiar with the family, small town, like I said, arrives and saw the blood on the door. He looks in the windows. He sees blood inside on the floors. He sees that the back door is unlocked.
Now, recurring theme on this podcast, throughout our podcast, is at what point do you recognize that things are sideways? And by sideways, I mean like, this is not a normal day. I'm not looking at, I heard hoofbeats and we are no longer dealing with a horse.
This
wrong, is a zebra. Right? This is a unicorn. Something is way wrong here, right? So at what point do you recognize it? Blood on the door? Blood on the floor? Blood inside? Back door unlocked? At what point do you go, whoa, I need an adult.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what do you do about it? And remember our case study on the JonBenet Ramsey case, which also interesting case, horrifying, but interesting.
Also, fun fact, in that top 10 that I talked about.
Yep. So key lesson from that is early police actions probably change the outcome of the investigation. Let me say that again. Early police actions probably change the outcome of that investigation.
Yeah, and I don't know that that's true for this one, but I think it's worth acknowledging that there are things you can't control.
Yeah.
Right? But if you can influence it favorably or even like unfavorably, like you should be aware of that and acknowledge that and obviously try to take the most appropriate actions accordingly. This deputy gets there, realizes that things were sideways, realizes like something's not right here. He calls for backup and they go in, clear the house. They find the 13-year-old boy, Slade, his mother, Brenda, who was 40 years old, and her boyfriend, Mark, 37, who was kind of the de facto stepdad of Slade, bludgeoned to death. And I mean like beaten, bloody, significant head trauma, ugly, beaten to death. All three victims had been tied up, and the investigation revealed that they had been hit in the head repeatedly with a hammer. There were blood trails throughout the house, and the deputy who was familiar with the family, as well as the neighbor, obviously, who called this in, knew that the family also had two young children, Shasta and Dylan, ages 8 and 9. And so that obviously takes things to another level because as they enter this house, they find the three family members killed and they wonder where are the younger kids. So they start searching the house. There's blood everywhere. And although they expect to find the youngest kids probably had a similar fate, it turns out they are missing.
Okay, so let's pause for a second. You're in the middle of this situation, right? It's a gory, awful crime scene. You know that two kids are missing. What does your checklist look like for this? Is there a checklist for this, right? If you have a checklist for this, the missing kid checklist, what assumptions does it make? Does this sound like a typical case of like a non-custodial parent running away with a kid? Does this sound like a runaway? Does this sound like a special needs kid like hiding maybe somewhere in the house? No, right?
Hope not.
This is sideways, right? What is our list of tasks right now, and what is the urgency of those tasks? Now, I've been involved in hunting hostage takers overseas, And one thing that really struck me when I was doing that work was the time value of action. The longer you take, the wider the radius gets. And by the way, you don't know when this event happened, at least not yet, right? So there's a time value on action. So you need to think fast, and you need to be effective fast.
Yeah. So the investigation that followed lasted nearly 2 months with no good leads and no good ideas where the kids might be. There were Amber Alerts that were issued. A media frenzy obviously ensued. The FBI was called in. They brought federal resources to bear in the hunt for these missing children. And investigators dug into every corner they could find. Brenda's ex-husband, the father of the children, all 3 children, was obviously high on the list of people they wanted to talk to. But when they went to him, he was as shocked as they were to find out what happened. And although it would be easy to kind of target him in the investigation, cell phone and computer forensics were able to corroborate that he was at home when the murders would have occurred. They thought that maybe when the murders happened, the kids were able to escape the home and run off into the woods. And so they scoured the countryside. There was some skinhead home invasion crew that was running around town around this time doing these like takedown robberies at houses. But they weren't taking hostages, and they wouldn't have had much reason to take off with the kids as far as they can tell. So they more or less ruled that out, right? There was a theory that maybe a motorcycle gang was involved because a hammer, like a ball-peen hammer, is a pretty common weapon of choice for a lot of motorcycle gangs whose members often can't possess firearms. So they thought, oh, maybe there's a motorcycle gang had something to do with it. But again, nothing really to corroborate that had anything to do with it.
Yeah. And this is an area where tech has come a long way, right? In that in 2005, not everyone had a doorbell camera. And so the extent of ubiquitous technical surveillance has kind of changed the game for stuff like this. And it's worth acknowledging that here. Talking about the skinhead home invasion robbery crews, motorcycle gang possibility, the thing that struck me is like one of the guys who started the FBI profiling unit back in the day wrote a book. His name's John Douglas. He's kind of a mover and a shaker and a commentator on the news. And I think his first book was Mindhunter. It's worth reading. I would consider that kind of mandatory reading for our audience. And I think he did a good job explaining the difference between MO, modus operandi, and signature. MO is the tactics or tradecraft that a criminal employs to accomplish a task. Now, MO can change and evolve. Signature is the stuff a criminal feels compelled to do, like picture weird serial killer behaviors, right? A home invasion crew might be brutal with their victims, but they're doing it for a reason, right? They're trying to do that to get drugs or money or revenge or send a signal, right? There probably isn't a whole lot of signature there unless they're specifically trying to communicate that signature to somebody. And there wasn't a whole lot of evidence that would be the case here, right? So I say that in terms of when you're trying to sort signal from noise, which is a big part of this game. Understanding MO from signature can help you sort that a little bit faster.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard because the signal and noise thing, you want to read into everything, right? Like every clue must mean something. And it's like there's anomalies in there, right? And so the fact that a hammer was used to beat these people to death, in their mind was a clue, when really it could have just been that's just how he was quiet about it. Oh, and that he was a psycho.
Yeah.
But I think that's a good point. One of the things that they considered was maybe it was drug related. Maybe there's a drug debt or something like that because Mark and Brenda, the mom and the boyfriend, had some drugs in their system. And so maybe that had something to do with it. There was a fingerprint they found on the front door where the blood was. Not a bloody fingerprint per se, just the same door that had the blood also had a fingerprint. And this seemed promising for a minute because it belonged to a guy who had a criminal past, and he had conveniently, at face value, notified his parole officer that he was going to be out of town. And he skipped town right when the murders happened. And so there was a really high interest in, like, well, it puts him at the scene of the crime, whatever. But it turned out the family had a barbecue at the house the day before the murders. And when he reached out to his PO and they said, hey, the cops want to talk to you, he came right back, offered the interview, was cooperative, agreed to a polygraph. And pretty quickly they were able to say, like, nah, I don't think that's the guy. The FBI profilers, Jim mentioned this, right? That they were obviously trying to get some sense of who would have done this or what kind of person would have done this. And the suggestion that they offered was that these murders, it was very, very violent. They were beaten to death with a hammer, right? All of them were. And it suggested that it was probably personal, that the person was probably someone the family knew or who was close to the family, or that this was some kind of revenge. And you can imagine that with like a missing children case like this, there's a lot of publicity. There was a tip line that was opened up. They got all kinds of like just random leads that they were trying to chase down, but nothing really concrete. At the end of the day, they really just had nothing.
Yeah, I want to hit the drugs issue real quick. So I'm not judging drug use. Like, I'd like to once again congratulate drugs for winning the war on drugs. But when we consider our risk situation, I need you to understand that involvement with drugs drastically changes your risk picture. Right? Right, wrong, indifferent, I don't care. Understand that if there's drugs in your house, that changes your risk situation. It just does. Okay? So from the perspective of law enforcement, what do you do when you hit a total wall? You have a case that you really need to solve. This isn't, a stolen catalytic converter, right? Yeah. Like, this is a thing you must take action on, and you hit a wall. I've actually been there in terms of trying to find a hostage taker. It was the most frustrating experience of my life. What I would offer is get creative, whatever that means to you. Bring in outside people to look at what you've got. Let the crazy guy in the back of the room talk. Mike and I talk about that a lot. Like, this is the time. Hey, Mike, what you got? Hey, Jim, what you got? Whoever the crazy guy in your room is.
We'll take it all, right?
Yeah. And like, this makes for good TV, but this is a really shitty situation to be in, especially like, you have responsibility to get this moving. So you need to get it moving.
Well, and it's not just make an arrest, right? Like that's the other thing too, is that like, okay, it's one thing when you're like, okay, we have these 3 dead bodies and that sucks. We should figure out who did that. But like, there are 2 missing kids.
Yeah.
And like, hopefully they're still alive and we can do something about that.
Yeah. It's sometimes at work, we talk about the break glass scenario. At what point are we willing to take elevated risk, right? In normal days, we don't take a lot of risks. Some days, yeah, you go ahead and take the risk. You try the crazy stuff. This is one of those times when like, yeah, let's try the Hail Mary, right?
So fast forward, what we know now about the murders is that a lunatic named Joseph Duncan happened upon and targeted this family randomly after seeing that they had young kids and that they were playing outside. That was what drew him to this family. He stalked them for a period of time before he made his move, and then he approached the house late at night, early in the morning, with a shotgun using night vision goggles. He was able to get inside through an unlocked door where he found Brenda asleep on the couch. He bound everyone with zip ties. He took Shasta and Dylan, the 8 and 9-year-old, out of the house into the yard. And when he went back inside, he beat Mark and Brenda, the mom and the the mom and the boyfriend. He beat them to death with a hammer. The 13-year-old Slade tried to get away. He tried to run outside, and he too was caught and beaten to death where Shasta and Dylan were able to see. And after all three were dead, he put Shasta and Dylan into the back of a stolen Jeep Cherokee and fled the scene. And Dylan, Shasta, and Duncan would not be found again for nearly 2 months.
I'm just going to take a deep breath after that. So, there's some lessons here, right? Is the lesson, don't let your kids play outside because a serial killer might see them? Probably not.
Gosh, no.
Right?
Right.
And
don't let them win, right? Like,
yeah, and I say that, like, I have a lot of friends who, for example, are very, very, very concerned about having their kids ever appear on social media. And one part of me gets that, and the other part of me is like, you know, I don't know that actually protects anyone, and two, I don't think that accomplishes what you want, right?
Right.
So my lessons are recognize surveillance. Surveillance is a sign someone is fixing to mess with you. We've talked about that in the past. How do I sort signal from noise? If someone is watching me, like really watching me, that should really stand out. That's a pre-attack indicator, right? Next lesson, bad guys have night vision. That's not sci-fi anymore. This is 20 years ago, 2005, right? It's 2025 as we recorded this. It isn't real common, but it is a long way from unheard of. So I think that is worth it just having in your head. Next, breaking zip ties is a skill. You got the rest of your life to learn it. It's not magic. It's not a huge secret. It's a zip tie. Yeah. Would that have saved them that night? I don't know. Probably not. But if someone's tying me up, that's a good sign that nothing good's about to happen.
Yeah, and right? in hindsight, for sure, looking at something like this.
Yep.
So this was May 2005. Fast forward, we're gonna skip some things here and jump to July. About 2 months later, Duncan, the serial killer, rapist guy, and Shasta, the little girl, returned to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And according to interviews, and some of these interviews are with Shasta herself, you can go on YouTube and find a lot of them, but also the interviews she did with investigators. Shasta said that shortly after Dylan was killed, we know now that Dylan was killed. Spoiler alert there. She more or less befriended Duncan in an effort to survive. There was a point in her captivity after Dylan, her brother, was killed where he said, "It's time for you to go. Would you like to be strangled or shot like your brother? And if you get shot, it'll be probably less painful." And she felt that if she said strangled, that maybe she would have more time to talk him out of it. So she chose that. He put a rope around her neck. And as she was being strangled, she used his nickname and tried to tell him to stop. And he let up and allowed her to live. She befriended him for a while and said, you know, would you like to meet my friends? Would you like to see where I used to live and things? And so he was ultimately made the decision to take her back to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And on the way into the Denny's to get some food one day, they also made a stop at a gas station. No one found that out until later. Obviously, the surveillance videos were able to confirm that they stopped at a gas station for some snacks. But they go to this Denny's, and on the way into the restaurant, Shasta, the 8-year-old at the time, saw a poster with her picture on it on the front of the business. There was a guy standing outside. She looked at the poster, looked at the guy looked at her and kind of nodded, and she nodded back, you know, in this sort of subtle,
knowing way.
Yeah, cry for help in a sense. They went inside the restaurant. The man that was outside also went in and told the staff there. A server who immediately recognized the girl. She had just come back from her break. went to go greet them and, hey, what can I get for you guys? Can I get something to drink? Notices the girl and right away, like, doesn't know who the guy is, but sees this little girl and she's like, that's the girl from all the pictures. She goes back and tries to play it cool, takes their order, tells her manager, like, you need to call this in right away. Like, other people in the restaurant started to pick up what was going on. And there was this sort of ad hoc effort. People were doing what they could to kind of come up with a plan of not letting them leave, right? They called the cops. The cops were on their way. The server had made kind of this effort of like, hey, the printer's not working. I can't print your check, and kind of stalling and doing these things. The cops get there. Duncan was taken into custody without a fight, and Shasta was rescued. But, at this point, no one knew what was up with Dylan. He was nowhere to be found.
So, two key lessons I want you to take here. One, on the law enforcement side, you need the public. And my exposure to law enforcement across the country is some agencies just fundamentally understand that, and some fundamentally don't. In a situation like this, you need a lot of sensors out there. You can create some ubiquitous surveillance if you educate the public what it is you need them to look for, right? Sometimes you're going to get a bunch of garbage. That is the nature of engaging the public. But it's a recurring theme that you need them. You need everybody on your side. You need everyone looking out for you, right? If you see something, say something. And the quality, the resolution, the stickiness, and the repetition of your public engagement is vital. You got to do it. The next thing is, have you ever pointed out to your significant other at a restaurant, like, don't look behind you, but there's this guy? What do they do every single time? Or like, don't make it obvious, but that's Nicolas Cage behind you, right? Think about how do you communicate that in a way that doesn't spook someone? And it's tough even for people who are pretty witting to, hey, we're playing a sneaky game right now. It's just so strongly human nature to look. And so think about how you're going to word that before you start that conversation.
One of the things about high profile cases like this that, if they open up a tip line, is there's a double-edged sword that comes with, hey, we're going to open up a tip line and say, like, if anyone has anything, because you're going to get a lot of noise. You're going to get a lot of garbage.
Yep.
And one of the things about those leads is there might be someone out there who knows something who fundamentally is not anonymous, right? Maybe they essentially want to dime somebody out. They want to tell on somebody, right? But they're also scared. And so they might make a tip under the guise, and this wasn't a factor in this case, but just this is a general public engagement thing of saying, like, they might call and make this anonymous tip about, like, how the angels came to them in the night and told them X, Y, and Z. And they might give, like, the location of something legitimate, right? And you have to follow up on that stuff, because although that was the story that they gave, they're also trying to save face, because they're not trying to get themselves killed or there's targeted or, whatever. And so although it might generate, having a tip line might cause a lot of logistic problems because you got to follow up on all that stuff, you can't take it for granted, because people might only give half truths, but that half truth might actually be something that solves the case. Again, not necessarily a factor here, but something to think about in terms of, like, engaging the public, like Jim is saying. So no one knows at the time that Dylan's already dead. All they know is that they got this call from the Denny's. They show up, they find Shasta and this guy, and they take the guy into custody. They take Shasta to get some medical attention, not knowing what she's been through. It's been 2 months since her family was murdered, and she shows up in this Denny's, kind of without much of a fight, right?
And hey, the suspect has rights and the suspect doesn't want to talk to you. Well, now what?
Yeah.
Where are we at now? And it's one thing when you're in a Dirty Harry movie. It's another thing when you're in real life, right?
Right. So they search his car. He's driving this Jeep Cherokee that the kids were abducted in, right? It was a rental from Minnesota that he never returned, and more on that in just a little bit. There was a ton of evidence in this car, and I'll point out some of that as we go here, but Dylan's whereabouts were a mystery, and no one knew at the time if he was dead or alive. And so they had to make the difficult choice to interview Shasta, the 8-year-old, in an effort to figure out where he could be and what happened. And that's not an easy call. They don't want, they assume that she's been through a lot, but they don't want to re-traumatize her any more than they have to, right? But there's a time component here, like Jim said earlier, time value of action, right? That radius gets bigger and bigger. And finally, they found the guy, they found one of the kids, and so where's the other kid? And they need to figure out, where is Dylan? Because they don't know yet if he's dead or alive. So they interview Shasta, and she gives her account of the story. She was asleep in her room. Her mom came in, middle of the night, early morning hours, woke her up, said there's someone in the house and he doesn't want us here. They go downstairs. She remembers seeing a man with a shotgun. She and Dylan get tied up and taken outside. While they're out there, they hear yelling. They hear a thumping sound. They're not sure what it is. They see Slade run out, trying to get away, and they watch him get beaten to death. Duncan takes Shasta and Dylan into the back of the Jeep and drives them to a remote campsite out in the woods about 100 miles away into Montana. So if you think about northern Idaho, is just kind of that narrow strip of real estate there before you're into Montana. And it's a little unclear, they might have gone to a couple of campsites, but they end up at this remote campsite, 90, 100 miles away. And over the course of several weeks, 6, 7 weeks, pushing 2 months, they are sexually assaulted and tortured repeatedly. During that time, Duncan bragged to the children about how he murdered their family. He showed them the hammer. He said, this is what I used to kill your family, and you're never going to see them again. And he also talked about other crimes that he had done in the past. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. Somewhere in there, after watching her brother get tortured over and over, and obviously being tortured and assaulted herself, she watches Duncan blow Dylan's head off with a shotgun. And if that wasn't enough, he forces her to help him move the body with a tarp to a fire to burn him. There's a USB drive that investigators found in the Jeep that had video footage of a lot of this to corroborate that story, those stories. And there's also a GPS device, like an old school, a handheld hiking type GPS device in the Jeep that investigators are able to use to ultimately find the remote campsite that he went to, as well as the burned remains of Dylan. So when Duncan was initially taken into custody, he didn't say anything, but later he confessed to the events. He admitted that when he arrived in Idaho, he had driven around town. They had that GPS device. He had actually marked the locations of several homes that had young children that he was considering targeting. And when all was said and done, he pleaded guilty to not only the death of the murder of Brenda, Slade, and Mark. He faced state charges in Idaho for first-degree murder and kidnapping for those 3. He also pleaded guilty to 10 federal counts related to the kidnapping, assault, and ultimately the murder of Dylan, as well as the charges against the crimes against Shasta. So 10 federal counts about those crimes. He explained in his confession how he covered his tracks. He said that he wore oversized shoes in case there were any shoe prints left behind. He wore gloves. He wiped down his shotgun and other things to cover up his evidence. He admitted to using night vision goggles to stalk the house. And I mentioned that video footage on that USB drive. There was several videos, but among the videos that were ultimately showed to a jury during the trial, the jurors who imposed the death penalty on Duncan were offered counseling to deal with the things that they had to watch during that trial. And some of those things included a 33-minute video that depicted Duncan naked, torturing and sexually assaulting a young boy who was naked and restrained, identified to them as Dylan. The video showed this happening in a rundown, like wooden shed or small cabin. And some of the other evidence that was presented to them included the human remains of Dylan, a wire noose from inside that cabin, and other videos of Duncan torturing Dylan. In one of those videos, a child could be heard screaming in pain while a naked Duncan shouted, "The devil is here, boy, the devil himself. The devil likes to watch children suffer and cry." In 2008, Duncan was sentenced to not only several life sentences, but also the death penalty. And he died of a brain tumor in 2021 while on death row in federal custody.
So we told you it was going to be a horror story, and here we are. This is, the narrative reads like fiction. It reads like a horror movie, right? And it's important to know, like, this was real life. This really did happen. And when we're dealing with people on the side of the road, or we're dealing with someone who approaches us at a Walmart parking lot, or someone rings your doorbell, odds are low that they're a Duncan, but they're not zero, right? And that should shape a little bit of how you assess people coming to talk to you, right? You don't have to freak out like every one of them is going to bludgeon you with a hammer, but like it ain't zero. Okay.
Now, I wish I could tell you that was the whole story.
But wait, there's more.
That is most of the story in terms of the 2005 murder and kidnappings that happened in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. But like Jim said, there's more. It will frustrate you and anyone else who knows of this case to hear that Duncan, not very surprisingly, had priors for such things. In fact, he was incarcerated at 15 years old for raping a 9-year-old boy at gunpoint in Tacoma, Washington. And during his time incarcerated, he did some interviews and such with the counselors and staff and psychologists in custody, where he was considered dangerous and uncooperative. And he had a host of psych diagnoses, including antisocial personality disorder, sexual sadism disorder, and there were some mentions in there of being a psychopath. No shit. Although I don't know if that was an official diagnosis. Nevertheless, he was released from juvenile detention at 17, at approximately which time he, I guess, successfully, somehow, apparently, enlisted in the U.S. Army. Thank you for your service, or whatever. He was discharged shortly after, dishonorably, for what it's worth, for drug use, of all things.
Yeah. So... okay. One of the reasons I think this matters is we as a country have a dialogue about a good dialogue, a healthy dialogue to have about, do we have too many people incarcerated? And there's a narrative that all of those people incarcerated are incarcerated for like smoking a joint. Now, I'm not saying that never happens. It does happen. But some of those people really need to be incarcerated. And there's also a thing about like, well, if your brain isn't fully formed until you're 25, okay, great. But if you can still murder somebody at 15 or rape someone at gunpoint at 15, then we need to do something to protect society from you. Similarly with like, does this guy have a mental health problem? But yeah, sure, he definitely has a mental health problem, but you don't get to just say, well, he's got a mental health problem, so we should leave him alone. Right? At some point, society, and I don't know, I'm not a criminologist, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a psychologist. I just know that at some point, society has to be protected from you. And there were a lot of clues here that this guy needed to be out of circulation, right? So my theme here is bad guys do bad guy things. That's both a warning to us and a clue if you're trying to figure out who done it, right? It is probably someone who has done bad guy things before.
Yeah, and it's hard because we don't have a crystal ball. We can't predict the future. And we can acknowledge that one of the things about bad guys do bad guy things, I do think this is an important distinction. Not all people who get in trouble are bad guys. Sometimes good or at least okay people just do bad things. And they don't necessarily mean bad, right? Like they did a bad thing, but they're not necessarily bad people. And you have to.
I would use that analogy of horses versus zebras versus unicorns, right?
Yeah.
Like the majority are horses. Someone steals something, jacks a car, gets in a brawl. Okay, fine. And then you got your zebras. The guy is consistently a bad hombre. And then you have your unicorns, like this guy's psychotic and he's going to murder more people.
Yeah. And then,
right?
Yeah.
Like that's where you got to be like, ooh, we need to do something about this cat, right?
Well, and even in the realm of like things like gun control, they talk about like red flag laws. Like how bad is bad enough? Yeah. I don't know the answer. That's a philosophical question. I'm not like, but this is something that you have to think about because this one gets, you think that's not, we're not done.
Wait, there's more.
There's more, right? So, rapes this kid at 15, at gunpoint, gets arrested, does juvenile time until he's 17, goes to the Army, gets dishonorably discharged for doing drugs. At 19, since obviously by then he's rehabilitated.
Nicely done, state.
Totally. At 19, he gets arrested for raping a 14-year-old boy at gunpoint in Washington. This is where it gets really fucking weird. Okay.
Not like before.
So, like, he did this when he was 15. He did it again when he was 19. And at 19, when he gets arrested for this, he gets a 20-year prison sentence, which he serves 14 of because, good behavior. They let him out on parole after 14 years of his 20-year sentence. Because clearly he's got to be fit for society now since he's behaved so well in prison. It wasn't like he had been bragging about molesting over 50 kids in prison, except, according to inmate testimony and psych exams, I guess he did that too. He bragged about molesting dozens of children starting at the age of 12 and acknowledged that he had no remorse and described himself as a monster in those evaluations. So he's out on parole. And in 1997, they violated his parole because they found out, somewhere in there was he got arrested for violating parole. He apparently was using marijuana, but they gave him more restrictive terms of his parole and let him out again, I guess. In 1997, they violated parole because he moved to Missouri without permission. Apparently, though, they hadn't yet found out that while out on parole, he also abducted and murdered a 10-year-old in California and two sisters, ages 9 and 11, in Seattle or near Seattle somewhere. Those cases went unsolved until after he was in custody for the Groene murders, when he was taken into custody after Shasta was rescued. The way they connected him to those was because he bragged about them to Shasta and Dylan during their captivity. And Shasta gave them some illumination on that in her interview. He confessed to beating the Seattle girls to death. There was a partial fingerprint that was found on some duct tape used to bound the boy in California that was sexually assaulted, kidnapped, and killed. And in 2005, when he was in custody for all that, he confessed to the FBI that it was a revenge on society. That was the reason that he did those things. He apparently wandered the country for a while under a bunch of aliases, doing God only knows what, in the amount of time that he was on parole, getting away with the murders in Seattle and California. And then he was arrested in 2004 in Minnesota for, you guessed it, molesting a 6-year-old boy. And this part's really great. He posts bail and gets released. $15,000 bond, and he flees the state. This is where he rents the Jeep Cherokee that he never returns. His travel plans to flee Minnesota while he's out on bail for molesting the 6-year-old lead him to Idaho, where he happens upon and randomly targets the Groene family after seeing the kids playing in the yard. What a shit show failure of our system.
Yeah, I spend a lot of tax dollars, and I give up what I would consider an awful lot of privacy and personal, I don't know if sovereignty is the right word, but, personal autonomy, hoping that I have a government that talks to itself, right? That a law enforcement agency who has a bad hombre in Seattle would talk to a law enforcement agency in California to Minnesota. That apparently wasn't true in 2005, and I'm not even a little bit sure it's true in 2025. So in terms of shit shows of failures of our system, we don't get to throw up our hands about that. Now, Mike and I aren't necessarily knocking on the individual LE agencies that responded. They were rolling this guy up regularly. They were rolling this guy up over years. Yeah. They were catching him. He wasn't that careful, right? But we got to find the lessons. And again, I can't just throw my hands up and be like, society needs to fix this, or the state of Minnesota needs to fix this. But we all need to recognize that this is a criminal justice reform thing that is failing to protect society from the most dangerous unicorn bad guys. The ones that should be the easiest for us to all agree should be separated out from us.
Well, and I'm empathetic that we can't treat every criminal like
Ted Bundy,
this
right?
monster,
Yeah.
Or Joseph Duncan in this case.
Yeah.
Like, we can't treat everyone like that. I get it. But there's got to be safeguards. Holy shit. We let this guy, we had this guy in custody over and over and over again, and we let him out.
How many kids does someone need to mess with before you're like, we're taking this guy out of circulation?
I mean,
right?
Listen, I became a cop in 2008. In 2008, if I ran a person's name and they were on parole and violated their parole for sexual assault on a minor at gunpoint, that would show up on my computer when I ran that name. In 2008, I guarantee you that the National Crime Information Center, if I ran a person's name in Arizona and he violated his parole in Washington, that would show up. And so how on earth can you tell me that when this dude gets rolled up in Minnesota, he's violated his parole and he's out of state now doing the same kind of thing? You're going to tell me that there's no way that was picked up on? What the fuck? So I don't necessarily have a big lesson or takeaway in that, but if you work in this system, if you're part of the criminal justice system, just remember that your job and your performance matters and that lives are at stake. I know that this was different states and different things were involved, and it's a big system. There's no one individual that this all rests or lies on. So I'm not trying to talk shit or throw shade, but the stakes are really high. And so if you work in this field, it's important that you are a professional and that you get it right. So I mentioned when I first heard this story, I was visiting Coeur d'Alene and someone pointed out this Denny's, and I'd never heard this story. And the more I read, the more shocked I was. And since then, I've thought a lot about what to take out of a story like this as far as an episode goes. I mean, on one hand, it's just a crazy story. And like, God, like what a just shit show, right? But one of the first thing that comes to mind for law enforcement is just imagine this is going on in your community. And I worked a high profile like child abduction case here in my city, but I hadn't really thought about this angle before. And I just want our law enforcement listeners to imagine getting that 911 call from the Denny's. Like, hey, I think the kid is here with some dude, right? How do you respond to that? Like, how do you walk into the Denny's and confront that situation? What precautions do you take? What tactics do you employ? How much help do you get? How much time do you take to wait and get those pieces in place? Like containment, additional resources. And I'm not going to dissect all that right here because I think that's part of the minutia that we were talking about earlier, right? Like it's going to be very regional. Like every town and city and state is going to have a different approach to that sorts of things. But there are a ton of factors that go into how you would respond to that kind of call. And all I'm saying here is just to take some time to think about and do some mental rehearsals about how you'd handle that call. Imagine the call shows up on your computer screen. Hey, I think the abducted girl is at the Denny's right now with some dude. What do you do? How do you handle that? Outside of law enforcement, I want you to think about and imagine, do some mental rehearsals as well from the perspective of like a community member who spots the missing girl, right? Like the guy standing outside of the Denny's, the waitress at the Denny's, those people are goddamn heroes. And like, let's not like minimize or reduce their actions in all of this. That is a testament not only to them, but also to like the media and the public information efforts that go into stuff like this, right? And speaking of tactics and minutia, it's really easy to get caught up in like, I want to go kick down the door where this girl's being held captive or whatever, right? But like, no, like the public information side of this won the battle, right? And granted, it was before Dylan could be found and those things, but
I got to jump in on this when it comes to finding kidnapped people or hostages. In the tactical world, the SWAT world, and the military soft world, there's the phrase "find, fix, finish," or it goes longer than that: find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, disseminate, F3EAD. It starts with find and fix. Right? It doesn't matter how good you are at somersaulting through windows and kicking down doors if you don't know which door to kick. And that is a recurring theme. And like we tend to, I think on the tactical side, we tend to take that as a foregone conclusion that we know which door to kick. That is not a given, especially in cases like this, right? You have to find them. You have to fix their location, either keep them there or be able to predict their pattern of life with enough fidelity that you know where they're going to be by the time you get your door kickers there, right? None of that's a given. That is, in many ways, the hardest part.
Yeah, and I think this example is a good testament to those media. I mean, like I said, first and foremost, to the people who were paying attention, who were on their game, recognized the girl, and didn't downplay it, didn't reduce it, took action, made the call, right? Didn't try to rationalize their way out of it, do the normalcy bias thing. Like they They did what we needed them to do. And the girl was rescued and the guy was arrested because of their efforts. And who knows what would have happened if that was not the case. And also to the public media, public information and the media efforts on all of that, especially months after the disappearance, right? This was like 7-8 weeks after Shasta and Dylan went missing, and people were still on their game about it. And I think that's a huge testament to everyone involved on that side of it, outside of law enforcement. And so I want to make sure we recognize that. In case you're wondering, Shasta has done a bunch of interviews, and she's actually doing pretty all right, in spite of obvious challenges that would come with that sort of thing. She's gone through a bunch of treatment. She struggled with some addiction and stuff when she was young. She explains in some interviews that, she was getting a lot of attention and she just wanted to be a normal kid. She wanted to go party and just, and so part of her escape from that led her to some addiction that she's overcome. She's a mom. She's a wife. She wants to get into like counseling, be a therapist, and help other people who have been through some stuff. She's expressed some interest in writing about her experience. So I think, among other things, this story is also a very humbling story of resilience. For everything that she went through, she overcame, right? And in one interview, she spoke a lot about trying to not always push away the memories that surface about what happened, because she doesn't want to give them that much control over her. She doesn't want to be defined by the things that happened. And I think there's a lot to be said about victimhood and survival and coping by hearing her story. So if that is something that resonates with you, go listen to her interviews and see what she has to say. She's actually spoken out quite a bit about that sort of thing. And it's pretty remarkable considering the absolute horror that she went through. She was the lone survivor in this family that was killed. Her dad was still around, obviously. He was the one that, she was living with her mom, the boyfriend, her two brothers. And then her dad was obviously still a survivor in this case as well, but a remarkable story of resilience. And I think her story is worth listening to. One of the things that I want to talk about as it pertains to this episode is about teaching kids how to interact with strangers. We've talked about this a time or two. I've written a little bit about it before. There's like the stranger danger thing, and that's real, right? Like, this is a good example of that, obviously. In fact, the case in California that Duncan was involved with, where the little boy, the 10-year-old boy, was abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered, was exactly that. He approached a group of kids. He asked for help looking for a cat. They refused. He grabbed the little boy, the 10-year-old, at knife point and drug him into a car. And that's how he met his fate. But that's an anomaly, right? That is the big and scary. That is terrifying, 100%. And we have to teach our kids about that. I'm not shying away from that at all. But more often than not, kids are victimized by someone they knew. And something that comes to mind in terms of this sort of story is that Shasta got that guy's attention outside of Denny's. Well, that was a stranger. And that was a source of help for her, right? She makes eye contact with this dude. He nods at her. She nods back. The waitress at Denny's, I think it's worth mentioning that people are mostly good. And that if you are in danger and truly need help, especially a kid in a situation like this, I would like to think that very few people would turn away from that. Like even some of the baddest criminals I know would step in and help in a situation like that. There's a reason child predators don't do very well in prison.
Yeah. So we did a whole episode about this, right? Groomers versus grabbers. And the thing about teaching kids not to talk to strangers is that we expect adults to be able to talk to strangers. So at some point, you need your kid to be able to interact with other humans. So I need you to have a little bit of a nuanced view of how you want your kids to talk to strangers and what boundaries they can and should set. And I don't want you to scare your kids. Like I'm as paranoid as it gets about security, right? And I try to be very careful about not inculcating my kids to just live in fear. So as much as I want to run them through, like, yeah, let's watch the movie Ted Bundy and let's watch all of the, approaches that he used and all the tactics that he employed. They probably don't need to see that at 9 and 10. That's my job, is to watch out for stuff like that, right?
Yeah. Distill the lessons, maybe.
Yeah, like
in a consumable format for kids that age.
Not everyone who acts friendly is friendly. Not everyone who is asking for your help needs your help. And maybe before they go off to college, we'll have a little talk about enforcing boundaries, right? But yeah, just saying don't talk to strangers isn't super effective. And
it lacks a whole bunch of nuance. And I think it's very unlikely that a kid in trouble with a child predator would randomly happen to flag down another child predator. Like, if your kid was actually in trouble, they could probably run up to literally anybody else in that scenario. And arguably, maybe that's exactly what they should do. I think there's a pretty good case to be made for something like that. Just a thought that I had in terms of what we teach our kids about strangers. The last thing that I want to talk about in here is just generally about like darkness and evil.
Not like all the happy talk we've had throughout this whole episode.
Obviously. Jim touched on this a little bit, but as a dad, I think about pretty often like my desire to protect my son's innocence. And as he matures and gets older, like he said, I think it's important for him to understand that monsters do exist. And also that those monsters can be defeated. But it's a hard balance. Like, I want to educate him about that stuff, but I don't want to like freak him out. I don't want him to live a life where he is scared and stunted by those possibilities, right? And he's old enough now to recognize that most of the time we go out in public and I'm carrying a gun. And he's old enough now to ask why I carry that gun. And sometimes when we're out in public, he notices it and he whispers about it because he knows it's something we don't really need to advertise and talk about. And more recently, he's asked to see my guns. He wants to see the gun and what it's about. And I just tell him that, I have it to make sure that I can keep him safe, that we can be safe, right? And he talks about like, in case you have to shoot the bad guys. Like, these are things that I try to be very intentional about what and how I say things to him about the evil things that are out there, and especially my job and the realities of the world that we live in. I want him to be aware of that potential danger, right? I want him to know about boundaries and when to speak up and say something. I want him to know that in the right circumstances, it's absolutely okay to kick and scream and to fight. But I also want him to feel safe and to see all the good in the world, because the truth is there is a lot of good in the world. And there's a friend of mine from work. He told me a quote not too long ago, and I don't know where he got it or the best way to attribute it, or if I should be naming someone else other than him. But he said, if you walk outside during the day and you look up at the sky, the stars are still out there, but you can't see them until the night comes. Sometimes you need the darkness to see the light. And I thought that was a really good point about dealing with the struggles of, the darkness and the evil things that are out there in the world and all the good that there is to offer, right? Because there's a lot of good, but sometimes you don't see it until you're confronted with the evil. And I'll be honest with you, when I was putting this episode together, I had a hard time watching some of this stuff, some of the interviews and like reading up on this case. Like, this one was bad. And I've been exposed to a pretty fair amount of shit in my day. Like, I've seen some things and dealt with some things, But this one was ugly. This one was pretty bad. And I was reluctant to even publish this. I'm like, do our listeners really need this? Like, is this helping? What are the takeaways I have that can really be useful out of this, right? But I think especially for those of us in this line of work, and I assume Jim's line of work as well, right? The military, law enforcement, public safety, like we need to be careful about our consumption. We see a lot of things, right? And the things that we see and deal with all the time are not normal. And I think that it's important that we pay attention to and monitor our diet, right? Just like we, don't want to eat too many sweets or too much processed food, and we want to monitor our diet, just like we don't want to drink too much or, anything in moderation, right? Similarly, with the amount of evil, shitty, dark things that we expose ourselves, that's part of our diet too, and we need to monitor our consumption on those things and be careful because it's easy to get eaten up by that. And I think this is among the reasons it's important that we have good, healthy outlets that we talk about and process those ugly things that we see and that we experience, and that we also make sure that we are going out of our way to expose ourselves to the good stuff, because there's a lot of good stuff. And don't get eaten alive by the bad stuff, right? Take some lessons from Shasta. She tells us in her interviews, she doesn't want to let the things that Duncan did control her or define her. And she's gone out of her way to make sure that that's true. And she's out there living a good, healthy, productive American life, right? Like there's lessons in that of resilience and all of those things. So I think that's all I got on this nasty, nasty human, Jim.
Yeah. On the topic of darkness, 100% agree with Mike, right? The world is generally speaking a warm, fuzzy, happy place. And it is important to remember that. And instances of true evil or true atrocity are super rare. They stand out because they're so rare. The Ted Bundys, the Ted Kaczynskis, the Columbine shooters, right? They stand out particularly because they're rare. Thankfully, they're rare. But if you're going into the law enforcement realm or you're going into the military, understand that you're going to see ugly stuff. You're going to. That is part of the job. Not every day, not every month, not every week, not every year. But you're going to come across it at some point. You're going to come across the nastiness that is humanity sometimes. And I think you will be more effective and safer if you know that that is in the realm of the conceivable. If you can imagine that the hoofbeats are probably a horse, they might be a zebra, or they could be a unicorn. And forgive me for keep bouncing back to that analogy, but I think it's useful in this case. You might catch the really bad guy, which is what I want you to do, right? Because you're the one who's got to deal with it. And I would even offer a lot of jobs in emergency medicine or even being a lawyer. You're going to see a lot of the worst people on their worst days. And even the best people on their worst days can be pretty nasty, right? And setting your expectations for that a little bit might help you prepare to cope with it. So giddy up, because at some point you're going to have to deal with it. Hopefully, you're not going to deal with this dude. But if you do, I want you ready. That's all I got.
Yeah, please be a professional. Remember that the stakes are high and get it right. It's a big deal. And I'll end with that. All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you. This episode is also brought to you by 09 Holsters. We talk a lot about people, ideas, and hardware on this show. So when we invest in equipment, we always think in terms of experience first. 09 is helping you figure out how to carry the gear you need to be effective. They are built by cops, for cops, with a minimalist design and bomb-proof durability. Radio cases, flashlights, body cameras, even canine remotes, you name it, 09 has been filling a void in tactical duty holsters for more than a decade. Go see what they offer at 09 Holsters. That's ZERO, the number 9, holsters.com. 09, built to win the fight. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.